Zelensky visited Capitol Hill, and the picture on screen is not from today. Many of you will remember it. It's from about a year ago. After the Russians invaded Ukraine, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, a bunch of months into it, like 5, 6, 7 months into it, after they had held back the main Russian advance and had started pushing back in Kherson and Kharkiv, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky visited Washington, D.C., made a speech to everyone in the House and to all of the legislators. They were all very supportive. They clapped. They all said, you know, Slava Ukraini. Zelensky gave them a Ukrainian flag that was signed. Kamala Harris, Nancy Pelosi, picked it up and waved it around, and they said that they'd be with Ukraine until victory, until all this stuff was through. And now it's a year later, and Ukrainian aid is drying up. We are at the lowest aid levels since pre-big invasion. So I'm talking about January 2022, before the February invasion a month later. So we are at the lowest aid levels of the entirety of the big war, the 2022 war. And the Republicans are now tying immigration reform to Ukraine aid as a small subset of Republicans hatches a plot from within the party to sabotage aid. And it's not just them. It is also foreign politicians like Viktor Orban, who is visiting the United States recently, is going to be visiting the United States soon, and is going to be having closed-door meetings with Republican legislators trying to organize against Ukraine aid, as Viktor Orban oversees in the EU holds up $50 billion worth of aid from the European Union, making it so $111.5 billion worth of Ukraine aid is currently gridlocked across the transatlantic alliance. $61.5 billion from the United States and $50 billion from the EU, which would be given to Ukraine in financial assistance up until 2027. So a lot of it is being held up 1 year later after seeing such overwhelming support. Why has this changed so drastically in a short period of time? Well, I think it's a few reasons. I think, for one, while shortly after this picture was taken, the Ukrainians took Kharkiv and they took Kherson, and they had some victories, taking back over 50% of the territory that the Russians captured since the start of the 2022 invasion. But since then, and since the start of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Zaporozhye, there hasn't been much more territory liberated. There's a little bit of land across the Dnieper River, but the front line is having tiny pieces of territory traded. Not much big gains either for the Ukrainians or the Russians. Now, some people use the word stalemate to describe that state of affairs. And while I will say the front line is has largely become entrenched, and it's taking a lot of effort to make marginal gains, that doesn't mean that the war has stalemated. That makes it sound like both sides are locked in, they're not moving, and there's nothing you can really do to push one side either way. But that's not really the case. I know Timothy Snyder has made the point that it's not really a stalemate. If this isn't like a game of chess, you can put 3, 4, 5, 6 more pieces on Ukraine's side of the board and tilt the favors, the odds in their favor, changing the battlefield and moving the front line in Ukraine's favor. You can do that right now. So is it a stalemate if you have that option on the table? Is it a stalemate if the Ukrainians are making big victories in the Black Sea, where they're still able to target Russian shipping? They're still able to target the Russian Black Sea Fleet and target it with their naval drones and missiles, and sink a submarine, delivering Russia some of the most humiliating naval defeats since the end of the Second World War. That isn't to mean that this is only all going in Ukraine's way. These are just some of Ukraine's example. So Russia has examples too, where for the Russians, they have massively increased military spending to over $110 billion, to the point that it's exceeded social spending. That is something that's going to be in their favor in the long run. The Russians are massively investing into artillery production. That is something that's going to come in their favor in the long run. They're investing more and more into drone production and drone usage on the front line. That's something that's going to help them in the long run. They're engaging in more small assault teams, copying much of what the Ukrainians were doing earlier in the war during the Zaporozhye counteroffensive. offensive when they traded the large-scale armor assaults for assault teams around Avdiivka. That's where the Russians are doing it. They're making adjustments too. So when we say stalemate, or the way that how the media talks about it, I think it paints this image of like, oh, it's an endless hole that if you just dump more guns into, nothing's going to change. When we do know that if we were to give the Ukrainians more capabilities, more tools, they would put it to use, as they have done before. And we also, well, when I say I know that, what I can say is that I've seen them do it firsthand. I know that if we gave them more aid, they would put it to good use. And I know that if the Russians were to have more shells fired at them, the consequences for their attacks on Avdiivka, or for them trying to take the rest of the Donbass, it would be devastating for their plans, which is why they're investing in trying to stop aid from coming to Ukraine, either through the European Union, the United States, or even through the Asian Pacific. So, point is, though, it's not really a stalemate if, in the way that the media describes it, or the way people think about it, if there are still so many different moving pieces of this war that are changing, like what happens with the Black Sea Fleet, and you can change how the war is being fought, or who has how much power on either side of the war, or how well each side is doing, depending upon what pieces you have available that you can put on the board. It isn't a game of chess, it's a war. Okay, so moving forward, obviously we're not where we were a year ago, but Zelensky came to Capitol Hill. How was the reception? Well, didn't get a lot of attention in media. Part of the reason why we're dedicating today's stream to this. Didn't get much attention in the media. And the reception from Republicans, some of them not very positive. This is from yesterday, not from today's meeting. So this is what Zelensky was going to be walking into for some discussions for the most fringe of the Republican Party. This is from Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. With Zelensky in town and Ukraine money running dry, why doesn't anyone in Washington talk about a peace treaty with Russia? A deal with Putin promising he will not continue any further invasions. Answer: Washington wants war, not peace. Isn't that awful? I'm still a no. Now, once again, context, added context, undefeated. Russia breached next treaties and agreements with Ukraine. UN Charter, 1945. Nuclear NPT, 1970. Helsinki Accord, 1975. Bolshvana Accords, 1991 and 92. Budapest Memorandum, 1994. Black Sea Fleet Treaty, 1997. Friendship Treaty, 1998. Treaty on Azov Sea and Kerch Strait, 2003. And the Kharkiv Pact, 2010. That's not even talking about any of the Minsk Accords or the 200 rounds of negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians since the start of hostilities in 2014, or the 12 negotiated ceasefires, which all of were broken. Point is, though, that I think context added is trying to get at here, and why they believe this context is necessary, is that it's not as simple as making a deal with the Russians if the Russians are not going to respect the deal, or we have no mechanism to make it so that they respect the deal. I'm not saying that it's never okay to make deals with people who are untrustworthy. What I am saying is that if you keep giving a guy $20 after he stuffs it into his pocket and says he's going to give you something and then he doesn't, if you keep falling for this scam of like, oh, if you give me $20, I'll give you a house, and he gives me $20. Oh, no, do it again. Keep doing it over and over and over again. At a certain point, you're being played. So either you get your house from him and you make him give you the house, or you don't engage. And so if the United States doesn't have something to enforce the Russians not invading Ukraine again, like a unilateral defense pact, like Ukrainian membership of NATO, if we don't have anything that can physically stop the Russians from doing it again, why should we believe that they're going to respect any sort of ceasefire or peace treaty? Why would this be anything other than short-term solution to just pat yourself on the back? I'm not saying that you can't negotiate peace, period, but the idea that the problem here is that there simply hasn't been enough talking. That the real problem between the Ukrainians and the Russians is they just haven't sat down and fucking talked it out is silly. Again, 200 rounds of negotiations, 12 negotiated ceasefires. The position of the Ukrainian government and the Russian government are irreconcilable. Just telling them to talk isn't going to fix anything if the Russians are still saying that as a precondition to have discussions, the Ukrainians have to pull out of Kherson, they have to pull out of Zaporozhye, they have to pull out of Donetsk, and they have to pull out of Luhansk, as well as recognizing Russian claims over Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and Crimea, creating a Ukrainian rump state that's lost 80% of its coastline. If they accept that as a precondition, what negotiation is there to be had? It's just, here's Russia, here's everything you want. There it is. So when we talk about like, oh, bringing the Ukrainians back into reality, we need to understand that the Ukrainians are the ones defending their nation state, fighting for a future where they have a semi-free economy, where they have a coastline, and they can continue to be the breadbasket of Europe, where their farms aren't stolen. So they can be a functioning European economy. They can function within European structures and function within the world economy, and not have its sovereignty treaded upon. That is what Ukraine is fighting for. I think these are all moderate, reasonable demands, and that isn't the terms that Russia wants to meet Ukraine on. And since these two positions are irreconcilable, just telling them to negotiate and make a peace treaty isn't that helpful if there's already been 200 rounds of negotiation, none of them leading to a peaceful solution. It's not that they're just not brave enough to sign a piece of paper and say ceasefire, because they've done that 12 times, and that hasn't fixed the problem either. So it seems that we need to change the factors on the ground to make it so that a peace is sustainable. But the problem is Marjorie Taylor Greene doesn't want Ukraine in NATO in the first place. Marjorie Taylor Greene doesn't want the United States to have a defensive pact with Ukraine. What Marjorie Taylor Greene wants to do, since we wouldn't have any mechanism to enforce said peace treaty with the Russians, is make the Ukrainians make a deal with the Russians, give up a bunch of their land, and then just hope that 13th ceasefire, this time it'll succeed. 13th time's the charm, I guess is the saying. But this is the environment that Zelensky knew he was going to walk into for some Republicans, and that's the party he has to convince. Democrats already basically united on Ukraine aid. There's a few progressive Democrats who are against the idea of bundling Israel aid with Ukraine aid, which I honestly understand, but that's a minority position, and that is not the thing that's holding Ukraine aid up right now. Moving on, Zelensky had his meeting with the legislators, and I got this message from I got this image sent to me in Discord. I think it was from Maria of Kiev tweeted this out. Republican senator unmoved after Zelensky's first meeting of the day. Ukrainian President Zelensky just finished meeting with the Senate side of Congress, and he's on his way to meet with House Speaker Mike Johnson and other lawmakers soon. A senator out of the first meeting said he was unmoved by the leader's visit. Republican Senator Eric Schmidt said he was told nothing new and that the questions were very scripted. By the way, I don't know if you guys have been following the nomination process for all of these officers and generals in the military and how it was being held up by Tommy Tuberville because he didn't like the Biden administration's pro-choice policies when it comes to providing health care for service members and women. Basically, what the Biden administration said, this is their policy, was that since Roe versus Wade was overturned and certain states were banning abortion, they were going to provide, the military was going to provide service members with costs for travel if they wanted to go to another state in order to get reproductive health care services, since they want all of their employees in the federal government, they want people in the armed services to be able to have equal access to reproductive health care service, no matter where they're stationed, no matter where they are. So they don't, and they say that it's a discrimination issue where they don't want somebody, oh, our service member in Maryland, they can get an abortion, but our service member who's over there in Idaho right now can't. And so they wanted it across the board. And so the football coach, senator, decided, nah, he doesn't like that. And instead of introducing legislation and passing it to try to stop it, which he can't because Republicans don't have the Senate, instead of trying to find some compromise or something like that, what he did was hold up completely unrelated officer and general nomination hearings, hold up their nomination process when it was their nomination was bipartisan and has been bipartisan, and held them hostage knowing that it would degrade the readiness of the armed forces, under the assumption that this type of hostage taking tactics would get the Biden administration to cave. It didn't, and eventually Tomer Tuberville dropped most of, I think he's still holding 11 generals, 11 like 4-star generals or something like that, but he dropped the vast majority, like over 440, 450 or something, of his holdups. Eric Schmidt, this guy, the only reason I brought up the story, he's now considering doing the same thing. So Tommy Tuberville has opened up Pandora's box, but he's doing it instead for wokeness. So he is worried that the people we're putting in military positions believe too much in the diversity and inclusion and wokeness nonsense. At least that's his angle on it. So, you know, keeping the military nonpartisan is going to be a difficult task going into the rest of the 21st century. But moving off from that, he said that he was told nothing new and that the questions were very scripted. So I read about the closed door meeting. We don't have any audio. We don't have any video because it was a closed door meeting. And Zelensky made the plea to legislators, and he seemed to have made it quite passionately, because at one point he said, he warned that if Ukraine was unable to get Western help, was unable to get aid to support its struggle against the Russian invasion, that it might have to resort to guerrilla-style warfare, i.e., you know, Mujahideen, IRA-style warfare, guerrilla-style tactics, since they wouldn't have the Air Force or artillery production or whatever would be necessary to hold the front line with the Russians in its current state. So he came with a pretty dire warning for the Republicans. He said that they would do their absolute darndest, as they've said time and time again, to make sure that American aid is well used and accounted for. We already know that an inspector general has been appointed. The Republicans keep talking about transparency and making sure that the money is you know, keeping, you know, doing the bookkeeping and et cetera, but they don't seem to be proposing much, if any, new regulations in order to see that through. There have been both Republican and Democratic senators who have visited Ukraine in the past already and have checked the process of how these weapons are being used and said they could see no discrepancies. There's already an inspector general appointed. I don't know what more the Republicans could request. I think at this point, they're just throwing whatever they can at the wall. So he heard their concerns. He talked about their concerns. But one thing that this article notes, and I do want to point out, where is it? Where is it? I gotta find it. Man, I can't seem to. I know it's here somewhere. Here it is. Although Zelensky received no formidable pushback from his audience, Senator Roger Wicker said that both parties are going to have to negotiate in some meaningful way rather than simply restating their position over and over again. He said there was little prospect that the two sides would reach an agreement on Ukraine aid in the next week, and House members are expected to leave Washington by this weekend regardless. So I've heard some Democratic senators propose extending the House another week to try to deal with much of the legislative issues that the nation has to face, like immigration, like Ukraine aid, but Republican legislators have yet to bite on that. So, you know, they're in Washington, but I don't know how much they're in Washington to actually work. Oof. But the other point I wanted to point out here was that he received no formidable pushback from his audience. So this is the other thing I wanted to talk about. The issue of transparency. Zelensky's there. They can ask him. He's there. He's right there. Here's the moment for transparency. You want to ask him about how Ukrainian weapons, after being sent to Ukraine from the United States, are being sent to the cartels. If, you know, somebody wants to throw the Vivek theory at him, if anybody wants to throw those Tucker Carlson numbers at him, they want to, if somebody in there wants to bring up Gonzalo Lira and say, oh, woe is me, is he being prosecuted? Hey, I heard the Christians are all being crucified. What's going on? What's going on in Ukraine? I heard you're a dictatorship now. I was watching the presidential debate. I heard you're a dictatorship now. All this stuff. They could confront the man himself. You know, the line doing, comedy having president of Ukraine. Line as in lines of cocaine, of course. But no, not much. Not much. After this meeting where Zelensky made a passionate plea, but it didn't receive much positive response from the Republicans, he also had a sit-down meeting with Speaker Johnson. That's the Speaker for the House of Representatives. He would be the person who decides if a Ukraine bill or any aid package to Ukraine would even come to the House floor. So it's not just an issue, and I keep bringing this up, it's not just an issue of, oh, there's not enough support in the House and Senate. Because the majority of people in the House and Senate, and the majority of Americans still, and the presidency still support Ukraine aid. But the problem is that if he cannot keep the speakership without placating a small fringe of his base, which are making it so that he can only pass Ukraine aid on conditions of immigration reform, large-scale immigration reform, that they've been unable to find any compromise with the Democrats on, or just not pass it all together. He needs to placate that base. And one way to placate that base is to just not hold the vote. And so it's being held up until that base can be placated by either A, large-scale immigration reform, which Democrats voted down like a few weeks prior, the bill that they're saying that they want to be passed with the Ukraine aid, or just not passing it all together, which, I mean, for the fringe of the party, I mean, it's win-win regardless. Even if some of them are going to pretend it isn't at the end of the day and they're going to call it a loss no matter what. If the immigration reform isn't passed and they're not willing to find some compromise with the Biden administration, who does seem willing to at least find some compromise on this issue, despite the precedent it would set to tie these two issues together. If they're unwilling to find some compromise, and it's going to be woe is me, woe is me, woe is me. I can't believe we didn't find an immigration reform compromise. And if the aid isn't sent, it's going to be God, man. Here's a question. I'm going to derail myself quickly before we watch this, but I wanted to ask you guys this question. Do you guys think that this is a sign of things to come when it comes to Ukraine aid? Do you guys, because I am of the concern, because what I would like to happen is when some deal is agreed upon on immigration, whatever deal that might be, hiring more immigration judges, well, if this happens, which I hope it does, I'm worried that every single time a new aid package might be proposed for Ukraine, it's only going to be passed on the preconditions that it's passed with more large-scale immigration reform, and it's just going to be used as leverage, where the Democrats have to always be at the top of their game, always united on this issue, because the Republicans are gonna use it as leverage to get their unrelated agenda items passed. The type of bundling that Mike Johnson objected to when he first became House Speaker. I think that's what I'm worried that's what's going to happen. Is going to become a tool for leverage every single time another Ukraine aid vote comes around. And that is what not only is happening in the United States, but it's also happening overseas with Viktor Orban and EU money that's being held up from Viktor Orban's government because of his violations of EU policy. Anyway, let's watch Mike Johnson's response to his meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky.
Thank you all for being here. Just had a good meeting with President Zelensky. I reiterated to him that we stand with him and against Putin's brutal invasion. The American people stand for freedom, and they're on the right side of this fight. I have asked the White House since the day that I was handed the gavel as Speaker for clarity.
Look at that. 5 seconds. Yeah, Ukraine, we support Ukraine. Anyway, the White House is the real people at fault here for blocking the legislation that we blocked.
We need a clear articulation of the strategy to allow Ukraine to win. And thus far, their responses have been insufficient. They have not provided us the clarity and the detail that we have requested over and over since literally 24 hours after I was handed the gavel as Speaker of the House. And
see, I doubt this. Number one, I doubt it because I know his voting record, and since the initial Lend-Lease Act, he has voted against every single aid package to Ukraine, right? So I don't know how much of the concern really is derived from what's the strategy to win. We think this is all guideless. Now, is the concern legitimately that Biden hasn't sat down and said, well, in order to beat the Russian artillery guns, we don't necessarily need to produce as many as them, but if we could just fire half as many artillery shells, is that what is necessary? That he needs to be like, well, if we produce more artillery shells, send more artillery shells, up the Ukrainian army's rate of fire, they'll be able to take more positions. If we get them the F-16s and give them some level of maybe not even air dominance, but even something resembling air parity with the Russians on the front line, then it'll be much easier for them to push forward their soldiers, because the American military would never approve a ground offensive without air superiority. Could you imagine us doing that into Iraq? What about when we were doing the operation to liberate Kuwait? What about Yugoslavia? Could you imagine us doing special forces on the ground, just taking village after village, town after town, without American air dominance if we wanted to do some sort of ground operation with U.S. forces? No, we wouldn't allow that. So is that, if the problem quite literally is, hey, we need you to sit down and give us the plan to win, as in how these tools will be used for Ukraine to win. I mean, Zelensky can do that, Biden can do that. I am not so convinced that that is the reason that they're holding up Ukraine aid. It just doesn't make sense to me. I can imagine that I have frustrations with the Biden administration not making harder commitments when it comes to Ukrainian territorial sovereignty. I have certain frustrations when it comes to the American government not stating clearly that where our goal is inevitably at the end of the day, as a coalition, to outproduce the Russians and make sure Ukraine is well funded and well defended and that it ain't going anywhere. And I think they've made the point semi-well when it comes to the idea that Ukraine aid is still there, but people don't feel it. People feel that it's cracking. And this is the type of stuff that people think is causing the aid to crack.
So what the Biden administration seems to be asking for is billions of additional dollars with no appropriate oversight, no clear strategy.
Again, the oversight thing. First, it was appoint an inspector general. Okay, we appointed inspector general. Then it was, we need to monitor this stuff. Okay, we send legislators over there to monitor, both Republican and Democrat. They go both in the Senate and the House. Go over there, check out the aid, check out the process, check out how the counting is done. They say it's fine. What exactly is he asking for? I keep hearing this question of transparency, and when it comes to the aid process, I want to know exactly what he is requesting. I want specific demands if it's going to be brought up as a reason as to why we're not sending the $61.5 billion that Ukraine needs yesterday.
Strategy to win, and none of the answers that I think the American people are owed.
By the way, when we say send, that makes it sound like we're sending over $61.5 billion over to Ukraine. 90% of it's going to be spent here to make the military goods and then send it overseas, right? So the idea that this is like money going in somebody's back pocket, financial fraud, like I don't know, man. We'll see if they can hide and resell those Abrams.
I have also made very clear from day one that our first condition on any national security supplemental spending package is about our own national security first. The border is an absolute catastrophe, and this is because of the policies of this White House and this administration.
Man, is this how it's going to work going forward? Where, let's say, for example, we have like some terror attack against the United States, or we have some massive national security issue, like, oh my gosh, Dylan, America, President Burns or President whoever, America's ally, the Swedes, were just invaded by some and then I go to Congress, like, we must act immediately. We have commitments, and we must, make sure that our legitimacy around the world is America as an ally, and we, the transatlantic alliance and economic stability and freedom, yada, yada, yada. And then Mike Johnson stands up and says, well, before we can do anything here, we gotta ban this TikTok thing. It's a threat. It's a threat to our national security. The Chinese, through their websites, are monitoring. And now look, you might have a real national security argument as to why the reason, the thing that you're saying that needs to be held up to deal with is important. But the idea that your issue is so important and so overwhelmingly the priority when it comes to the United States, that all other issues, national security-wise, should be put on hold, funding-wise and aid-wise, until a decision is made on an issue that is extremely divisive and that they've been unable to find a result for and a solution for before, after what, 2 years of the administration being in power, not even talking about the Trump administration, going 3 years now. I mean, this is a ridiculous demand. We're no closer or nowhere close to finding some compromise that we know of on the legislation that the Republicans tried to push through. It failed for a reason. We should not be tying two completely separate issues together like this, especially when the legislation that they're trying to push with this in question did not get a single Democratic vote in the Senate. Not a single vote. And now it's supposed to pass with a veto-proof majority in the Senate and in the House before the Biden administration then lets it pass his desk. And the longer we wait to find some compromise, and maybe there is a compromise to be had, but that compromise will only be had in February of next year or March of next year. The longer we wait, the more problems that might come up in the future when it comes to Ukraine aid, the more hiccups we can run into, and the longer Ukraine has to plan on and survive on the munitions that they have now, which is already extremely difficult and is going to make the war situation worse. And so if you want to try to solve the war as quickly as possible, the last thing we should do is have some wishy-washy policy where we're sending signals to the Russians. We're like, oh, maybe we'll stay in. Oh, maybe we'll come out. Oh, maybe we'll stay in. And maybe we'll come out. So they can turn to their people and say, look, see, they're on the brink. They're on the brink. They're on the brink. Because that's what I feel like this ultimately is. For Mitch McConnell, for Mitt Romney, the people that I know support aid to Ukraine but are going along with this, is that they're willing to gas up the Russians in that manner and delay giving the Ukrainians what they need to win for political purposes, to please the fringe of their base and for partisan political goals. And legislation that we were nowhere even close to finding a compromise on.
We had 12,000 illegal crossings on one day last week alone, on Wednesday. We have almost now 280 known terrorists that have been apprehended at the border. None of this counts the gotaways. If you add the numbers up, it's almost 7 million people who have been encountered at the border just since President Biden took office. And
could you imagine if there was like some farmer senator in the Senate and he was blocking up some legislation and his reason was like, I'm not allowing a single dime to be spent on the border till we get some troops sent to my state to deal with the wild hogs, until every single, again, this issue is important to you. Make the compromises necessary with Democrats to get the veto-proof majority in the Senate, or at the very least, the filibuster-proof majority, which is going to mean flipping 11 Democratic senators. Good luck with that. Good luck accomplishing that in such a short amount of time. I know it's a difficult thing to do, but you're the one who put the timer on the clock. You're the one who decided that you were going to tie it to this vital national security interest in Ukraine aid, which has a clear timer on it because the war is actively ongoing. We cannot just, we'll locate these bombs for 3 years down the line. They need the bombs now. They need the means to defend themselves now.
at least 2 million gotaways. This is twice the population of my state of Louisiana. Fentanyl is the leading cause of death for Americans age 18 to 49 in this country.
Again, all of these things, important issues. Biden has indicated openly that he wants to find compromises with the Republicans to deal with the fentanyl crisis. He's, during his talks with the Chinese, he was emphasizing fentanyl and trying to find some solution to work with them diplomatically to try to deal with the fentanyl crisis. These are issues that we can find real solutions to. Well, blocking Ukraine aid is not finding a solution. It is trying to strong arm the Biden administration while the clock is running out.
Fentanyl poisoning, because it's allowed over the border. We have human trafficking and all the other terrible things. In the last 3 months, October, November, December alone, we've had more illegal crossings at the border than in any entire year during the Obama administration. The American people see this. They feel it acutely. They see
why specifically the Obama administration? Whatever.
All the terrible societal ills that come from this, and it must be addressed. So I've made this very clear, again, from the very beginning when it was handed.
What do you even say to Zelensky, where he comes into this meeting and he's like, hey, I need to fight off the Russians. We need these means to fight off the Russians. You have these means. You guys have already said you need to invest in more production because your industry is not flexible, that it would be beneficial to your national security interests. You've made these commitments to us in the past that you will support us in our territorial integrity if our territory is infringed upon after we gave up our nuclear weapons and gave weapons to the Russians in return for security guarantees. Can you guys help us? Can you guys help us so that our country doesn't look like Bucha, that our country doesn't look like Izium? And then the response is, yeah, man, but we got to get like a compromise on immigration if we're going to support you. Why? Why are these two things connected? There's nothing he can do. It's completely out of his control. All those things that were talked about when it comes to transparency and the aid and all that, that's all smoke and mirrors. What the Republicans want is an immigration victory so they can turn to their base and say, "Oorah, that big mess we had and that showed that we were unable to properly govern the House, it wasn't all for nothing because we at least we got something here. We got some W. We didn't completely waste this time." That's what I feel like this is. Ukraine is becoming a partisan chip, which was the biggest fears of the people who supported Ukraine at the start, that with time, this would become partisan. And the more I talked about it, and the more I saw the warnings on the war, and I warned that this is a real possibility, I got pushback, man, but we have now arrived at that reality. We've now arrived at that reality where Ukraine is now a partisan chip. It is being used in a partisan back and forth between the Democrats and the Republicans. And the future of this country of 44 million people is now in the hands of people like Mike Johnson.
The gavel. We needed clarity on what we're doing in Ukraine and how we'll have proper oversight of the spending of precious tax.
What is that? Again, what does that mean? I want clarity on what we're doing in Ukraine. What do you mean what we're doing in Ukraine? Specific, like what our goal is in Ukraine? We've stated that goal before. Biden said that goal during the press conference later this day, and he said it before. He needs to be more specific. Like, is he asking for things like a withdrawal date, like the day we're going to end all aid? Because that's not something they can give.
Taxpayer dollars of the American citizens, and we needed a transformative change at the border. Thus far, we've gotten neither. The Senate has been MIA on this. The House passed H.R. 2 6 months ago, more than 6 months ago. It's been sitting and collecting dust on Chuck Schumer's desk. I have told him personally, I've told the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, that these are our conditions because these are the conditions of the American people. And we are resolute on that. It is not the House's issue right now. The issue is with the White House and the Senate. And I implore them to do their job because the time is urgent and we do want to do the right thing here. With that, I'll
Again, man, in the future, if I was to say something along the lines of, look, we cannot help fucking Louisiana with hurricane relief until you deal with the security issue and American infrastructure plan. Like, if this is how it's gonna go, it's moving forward when it comes to aid packages or it comes to foreign policy priorities. I think it's a dangerous precedent that the Republicans are trying to set. But the Biden administration is still indicating that it's willing to compromise. There has to be some compromise found here. After that kerfluffle, Zelensky did meet with President Joe Biden, and they sat in the Oval Office near the fireplace, talked about a new $200 million drawdown from the Department of Defense for Ukraine and things like artillery shells, anti-air capabilities, stuff like that. Let's check out this fireplace, this fireside talk that they had.
In the winter, this winter, Putin plans once again to bombard Ukraine's electric grid, intends to, with rockets and plunging families into darkness in the coldest part of the year and doing great damage. We can't and won't let him succeed. We mustn't let him succeed in that. Mr. President, I called on Congress to do the right thing, to stand with Ukraine and to stand up for freedom. And I want to thank you for being here. You're going to help the cause, and I don't want you giving up hope.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Dear journalists, are really glad to be here at the White House today and share some very important messages. Thank you for the invitation, and I'd like to thank American, our partners, for the support. And today, the special day, really special day for Ukrainian people. It's a day of our land forces. Almost 600,000 incredibly brave Ukrainian sons and daughters are on the battlefield, and they were powerful. This is their day, and really they prove every day that Ukraine can win. And our forces are advancing, and we have successfully defeated Russia in the Black Sea, and Russia is hiding the remnants of its naval fleet in.
Do you guys think? I've been thinking about that guerrilla war statement from Zelensky. And this is the thing I've warned about. I said this is a scenario where everybody it's just the worst case scenario for the Ukrainians. Obviously, they have to engage in a brutal asymmetrical war for their liberation, which is going to be awful. And considering how the Russians fought the war in Chechnya and fights anti-terrorism operations around the world, it's not going to be a light war. It's going to be a brutal war in occupied territory. If you thought the Irish Troubles were bad, get ready for something much horrific. For the Americans, it would be awful because in that America would look weaker, our credibility would be hurt, and the alliance would have still immense violence, almost now perpetually going on in its periphery on the border with NATO. And much of our NATO allies, especially those in Eastern Europe, would still feel incredibly unsafe, as well as this does not curb or snuff out or hit in the nose or really significantly wound the type of Russian chauvinism, nationalism, and imperialism on an ideological level or on a political level, like a political strength level, that led to this war in the first place, that led to the invasion, that led to the conquests. And for the Russians, it would suck because now a 3-day operation is fucking Vietnam. So it would obviously be bad for them. The Soviet Union spent a lot of money and lost a lot of lives fighting in Afghanistan. The Russians have already lost more lives than the entirety of the Soviet Union did during 10 years of war in Afghanistan in Ukraine. We've got new information out. Let me see if I can pull this up. New information out from U.S. intelligence assessing that the Russians have lost 315,000 casualties during the war in Ukraine. That makes up 87% of its initial invasion force, 87%, nearly 90%, and 63% of its initial tank fleet. 2,200 tanks was what was being reported earlier in the year. I assume that number is higher since some time has elapsed since then, but that was the last numbers I remembered.
Remote base, and meanwhile Ukraine has set up an export corridor in the Black Sea that's really boosting our economy and global food security. Yesterday I met with the IMF and World Bank, and they're impressed with the Ukraine's economic growth, almost 5%.
Oh, here's another good piece of news. The IMF approved a $900 million loan for Ukraine, which, look, I'm not the #1 biggest fan of the IMF. Ease of flow of capital is good for countries, especially ones economically struggling. And I want Ukraine to have a capital inflow. Don't get me wrong. Just structural critiques. But that $900 million inflow was really good. And it was positive news for Ukraine at a time where the aid question is getting people very nervous.
And that's significant. Ukraine is gradually becoming less dependent on aid, and we are moving to the right direction. And I want to discuss with the president how to strengthen it, especially enhancing our air defense and ability to destroy Russia's logistics. Our goal.
My friend was messaging me yesterday about how they were woken up in the middle of the night by missiles getting blown up over their house. They live on near Kiev, and Russian missiles are passing over to Kiev. The Russians tried to strike Kiev. They injured some people yesterday. They struck it with drones and missiles, the majority of which were shot down. But I do want to tell you guys that air defense is still desperately needed all across Ukraine. Ukraine is a gigantic country. And I mean, for American standards, not as much. But for European standards, very much. It's the largest nation in continental Europe. It is the largest nation in continental Europe. It's the breadbasket of Europe, not only because of the black fertile soil, but also because of just how much land and pastures they have. And with so much land across its territories and its people spread out, spreading out air defense is difficult. And Kiev is one city that I know that has quite a lot of air defense to protect it, but cities like Kharkiv, cities like Dnipro, cities like Kherson, but other Eastern Ukrainian cities need air defense desperately. And even Kiev still needs more air defense. The soldiers near the front line need more air defense, but the civilians especially need it.
Goals for 24 are clear. Take away Russia's superiority and disrupt their offensive operations. And I think it's real. And also some other...
I mean, I don't know how to exactly compare it, but what if I told you I needed you to secure enough air defense to cover the entirety of Texas? Hell of a tall order, huh?
Things I met with the heads of American defense companies yesterday. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Really powerful companies. I thank them and thanks all the workers, engineers, managers who built and build the strengths of American weapons.
Okay, I'm nerding out a little bit, but it technically wouldn't have to be the entirety of Texas. It would just have to be a bunch of major cities and logistical points, as well as where units would be spread out. But you get my point anyway. I'm sorry, I'm just being nerdy.
Helping Ukraine boost the development of arsenals of democracy. President Biden agreed, and we spoke about it in September, to joint weapon co-production. It's very important for us, and we'll discuss how to speed up this. And we also need to work faster with the frozen Russian assets, over 300 billion frozen assets from terrorists, and we should use it to protect against Russian terror. And
this is the thing that gets me. If you're against sending aid to Ukraine because it costs America too much, fine. I think it's silly. We're spending 0.5% on Ukraine aid. We're spending like our amount we spend as a federal budget on aid, period, is quite low. Just generally, it's actually lower than the global standard, not as a total amount, but as a percentage comparative to GDP, than the global standard for nations that are that have a per capita wealth like we have. But fuck, I lost my train of thought for a moment. I want to be in the Oval Office, not just for the novelty, but also because it looks real cozy. The Oval Office does look cozy, actually. It does look really cozy. I remember Trump removed some of the busts and replaced them with other busts. What bust would you guys put in the Oval Office if you were president? What bust would you put in there? Socrates? Malcolm X? Marx? Look, I would throw everybody a curveball and have it be Mr. Rogers. See, that's the bipartisan answer.
To talk about some
oh, but no. If you're against sending Ukraine aid because of the it costs too much, even though I think it's unbelievably silly to say that, considering comparative to the war in Afghanistan or the war in Iraq, and comparing it in price and what we've gotten out of it, is just incomparable. Relative to what we would spend, especially if there's an increase in defense spending all across continental Europe and the United States, if the Russians continue to encroach and the ideological conclusion of what Putin lays out continues to play out, as many historians has warned, many historians and Russia watchers have warned, wouldn't just end with Ukraine, but could go on to nation states like Moldova or back into Georgia again. Or into the Baltic states if NATO unity doesn't hold, which is currently being undermined or at least targeted by the Russians in an informational warfare campaign. They are making the long strides towards that. But even if all of that doesn't matter, you're like, I don't want to fight the Russian revanchism. I don't want to fight Russian imperial billion. This is stupid. The 300 billion that's frozen of the Russians isn't even your money. You can give that money to the Russians at no cost to you. It's a good deal.
details regarding our reforms and EU integration.
The Biden administration responded to the request, though, by saying that they wanted to keep it in negotiations. And my response to that was, if they want to keep the $300 billion in negotiations with the Russians, what they could do in order to try to entice the Russians to act, as well as making funds available for the Ukrainians now, as well as, showing you're serious in negotiations, is start to give the money to the Ukrainians in increments and say that once the Russians leave Ukraine, then they can get the rest of the money. I mean, the idea is, we're going to hold up the money to negotiate with the Russians so they can give us money to rebuild. So you're going to negotiate about giving them back money so they can pay you money to rebuild, while they're continuing to destroy the country that you want them to pay for the rebuilding of. I'm not saying that it's absolutely impossible and there's never any chance in a million years something like that could happen. What I am saying, though, is it's not happening anytime soon, and I think there's a high likelihood of it not ending in success. And with both of those things in mind, at the very least, we could start paying in increments.
Ukraine continues to reform its institutions even during the war. It's very important for us, and we are successful. I think that's very important, and people need to be confident that freedom is secure and strong enough to win. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you. And before the press, whoa, hush up a second, okay? Got one more thing to say.
Whoa, Nelly.
I just signed
Whoa, Jack.
another $200 million drawdown from the Department of Defense for Ukraine. And that'll be coming quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
President Biden, are you mad at me?
What are they even doing? Wow. Well, that was all pointless.
Thank you.
all that press jostling. Oh, C-SPAN's getting etched out now. No, C-SPAN. No, C-SPAN, no. Let C-SPAN stay. Let them hear all the secret meeting stuff. They're cool. They're cool.